excitedly looked out the window of his room. Orange pumpkins, artificial spiders, and plastic skeletons filled the streets. Tonight was Halloween, and he couldn't wait for the festivities and trick-or-treating. His mother, Sarah, called from downstairs. "David, come down, sweetie. You need to put on your costume." David rushed down the stairs. His father, John, was sitting on the couch reading a newspaper. "Son, what are you going to wear tonight?" he asked. David proudly said, "A werewolf. Mom made me a really cool costume." John laughed and said, "Great. I'm sure you'll scare everyone." Sarah brought the werewolf costume and helped David put it on. When he was ready, David stood in front of the mirror and growled, making his parents laugh. "Well, it's time to go out," Sarah said. "John, are you coming?" John shook his head. "No, dear. I have some work to do. You go have fun. I'll wait for you here." David and his mother left the house and joined the neighborhood children, all dressed in strange and wonderful costumes. It had gotten dark, and the sound of laughter and excitement filled the air. Hours passed, and David and his mother had visited almost all the houses in the neighborhood. David's candy bag was full, and he was tired but happy. When they returned home, it was past midnight. "Dad, we're back," David shouted excitedly. But there was no answer. Sarah said with surprise, "That's strange. I think he might have fallen asleep." They entered the house. Everything was dark. Sarah flipped the light switch, but the lights didn't come on. "How odd," Sarah whispered. "David, stay right here. I'll go see what the problem is." David stood in the darkness and heard his mother's footsteps heading towards the basement. Suddenly, a terrifying scream came from the basement. "Mom!" David cried out in fear and ran towards the basement. David fearfully descended the basement stairs. His heart was pounding, and his hands were shaking. "Mom! Dad! Where are you?" A rustling sound came from a dark corner of the basement. David squinted to see better. Suddenly, something jumped out of the darkness. It was his father, but not the father he knew. John's eyes were red and glowing, and his mouth was full of sharp teeth. Blood was dripping from the corners of his lips. "Dad?" David asked with a trembling voice. John growled in a way that sounded nothing like a human. "My son, come to Daddy." David stepped back. You're not my dad." At that moment, Sarah appeared behind David. Her face was bloody and bruised. "David, run!" But before David could move, John lunged at Sarah. The horrific scene David witnessed would be etched in his mind forever. David ran out of the basement with all his might. Tears were streaming down his face, and his heart felt like it was about to burst out of his chest. He knew he had to escape the house, but his legs felt heavy. Heavy footsteps were coming from behind him. "David, where are you going, son? Daddy wants to play with you." David ran towards the front door, but it was locked. He looked around in panic and saw the kitchen window. Without thinking, he grabbed a flower pot from the table and smashed it against the window. The glass shattered, and David threw himself out through the window. He fell onto the lawn. His arms and legs were cut by the broken glass, but he couldn't feel the pain. The only thing he wanted was to escape this nightmare. David ran through the dark and empty streets. The sound of demonic laughter echoed from every corner. The pumpkins that had seemed harmless before now stared at him with glowing eyes and sharp teeth. He ran to the neighbor's house and pounded on the door with his fists. "Help! Please help me!" But when the door opened, David jumped back in horror. Their neighbor, Mr. Johnson, was staring at him with white, soulless eyes. "David, come in. We've been waiting for you." David realized that the entire neighborhood had changed. Every house he saw was full of terrifying and demonic creatures. He was left alone in a world he no longer recognized. David, panting from fear and exhaustion, hid himself in the neighborhood park. He sat behind a large bush and tried to calm down. His mind was full of questions. What had happened? Why had everyone changed? Suddenly, he heard a familiar voice. "David, are you there, son?" David fearfully raised his head and saw his grandfather, George, looking around with a flashlight. "Grandpa," David called out cautiously. George turned towards the sound and sighed with relief when he saw David. "Thank God I found you," David asked hesitantly. You're not like the others." George shook his head. "No, son, I'm still myself. Come, we need to get out of here." They cautiously left the park and headed towards George's car. Once inside, George began to explain. "David, what happened tonight is a secret that's been hidden in our family for years. Every 100 years, on Halloween night, dark forces gain power and try to take over our world." David asked in surprise, "But why? And why our family?" George sighed. "Because our great ancestor, William, once stole a powerful spell from a witch. That spell had the power to protect the world. But now, the dark forces are looking for it, and they think your father has it." George drove the car towards the outskirts of town. David, still confused and bewildered, asked, "What do we do now?" Grandfather said, "We need to find the spell. It's the only thing that can stop this horror." They headed towards an old cabin in the forest. George explained that this cabin belonged to their great ancestor, William. When they entered the cabin, everything was covered in dust and cobwebs. George started searching, and David helped him. Suddenly, David found something under the floorboards. It was an old wooden box. When they opened it, there was an ancient book and a strange necklace inside. George exclaimed excitedly, "We found it! This is the spell!" But before they could celebrate, a growl came from outside the cabin. David's father, with red eyes and sharp teeth, was standing behind the window. George quickly gave the necklace to David and said, "David, listen. You need to activate this spell. Only you can do it because William's blood runs in your veins." David asked fearfully, "But how?" George opened the book and showed him a page. "Read this incantation and hold the necklace tightly." At that moment, the cabin door broke with a loud crash, and John entered. George went towards him to protect David. "Son, hurry!" David, with trembling hands, held the necklace tightly and began to recite the incantation. Strange words came out of his mouth, and with each moment, a weak light emanated from the necklace. John, with eyes flashing with anger and madness, attacked David. George tried with all his might to hold him back, but John was stronger than ever. David raised his voice and recited the incantation with all his being. Suddenly, a blinding light burst from the necklace and enveloped the entire cabin. The light gradually faded, and David opened his eyes. John had fallen to the ground and appeared to be unconscious. George sat down beside him, panting. "You did it, David. You activated the spell." David looked at his father uncertainly. "Dad, will he be okay?" George nodded. "Yes, son. The evil force has left his body. Now we need to go back to town and see how things are." They carried John to the car and drove towards the town. Along the way, David noticed that the sky was gradually brightening, and Halloween night was coming to an end. When they reached the town, everything had returned to normal. People were coming out of their houses in confusion, as if they had awakened from a deep sleep. A few days later, When everything had calmed down, David's family gathered to talk about the events of that night. John, who had fully recovered now, looked at David with shame. "Son, I'm truly sorry for what happened. I don't remember anything, but I know I did terrible things." Sarah, whose wounds were healing, took her husband's hand. "What's important is that we're all safe and together again." George looked at David and said, "David, you're the real hero of this story. Your courage and strength saved everyone." David gave a faint smile. "I just did what I had to do, but I still have many questions." George nodded. "You're right. It's time you knew everything." He began to recount their family history from William's time to the present day. He explained how each generation had been responsible for protecting the spell and why they had kept this secret from David. As time passed, David learned to cope with his family legacy. He trained under George to use the power of the spell and resist the dark forces. The family decided not to keep any more secrets from each other. They worked together to protect the town and its people, without anyone knowing their important role. David, now older and wiser, was more cautious every Halloween night. He knew that one day he might face the dark forces again, but this time he was prepared. A year had passed since that terrifying Halloween night. David stood in front of the mirror, looking at himself. He was no longer that scared and inexperienced boy. Now, he was a guardian, someone with a great responsibility on his shoulders. His mother's voice came from downstairs. "David, come down, sweetie. The guests are arriving." David smiled and put the necklace around his neck. Tonight, the Halloween party was being held at their house, but this time, he knew how to protect his family and friends. As he was coming down the stairs, he paused for a moment and looked at the family picture on the wall. A photo of him, his parents, and Grandpa George. They were smiling, but in their eyes there was a glimmer of alertness and readiness. David took a deep breath and whispered, "This year, we're ready." With that thought, he entered the living room, where his family and friends were waiting. Another Halloween night had begun, but this time David knew what to expect, and he was ready to face any challenge.